I never imagined the man I trusted like family would betray me like this, right in my own kitchen. As I turned from the sink, there he stood, his intense gaze locking with mine. "Hi, Mary," he said, his voice steady yet layered with something that sent chills down my spine. I knew then that this wasn't just a casual visit. My past had returned, and it was about to shatter everything. It had been years since my life had felt this steady. My husband, Bob, and I shared a quiet, predictable existence. We weren't a perfect couple, but we were comfortable. Our days were filled with small routines: morning coffee, shared glances across the dinner table, and quiet evenings spent reading or watching TV. We had built a life that felt safe, even if the spark between us had dimmed over the years. I remembered the first time I met Kevin. He was just a teenager back then, struggling to find his place in the world. Bob had taken him under his wing, offering him a home and guidance during a turbulent time in his life. Kevin was shy and uncertain, clinging to our support as he tried to navigate his path. I saw him as family, nothing more. But life has a strange way of evolving. Over the years, Kevin grew into a man, confident, sharp, and charismatic. He had been gone for 3 years, working out of town, pursuing his dreams and building a life of his own. Yet when I opened the door that day and saw him standing there, something in me shifted. His smile was familiar, but it carried a weight I couldn't decipher. His eyes, though, were the same, intense, piercing, and unwavering. They seemed to hold secrets I wasn't ready to confront. For a moment, the years fell away, and I was transported back to a time when his presence had stirred something within me I didn't want to acknowledge. Bob welcomed him with open arms, thrilled to see his nephew again. As they laughed and reminisced, I stayed in the background, wrestling with the emotions bubbling inside me. I had buried those feelings years ago, convincing myself they didn't exist. But now, standing in the same room with Kevin, they came rushing back, unbidden and unwanted. I tried to tell myself that his return was innocent, that his presence was just a reminder of family ties. But deep down, I couldn't shake the unease. There was something in the way he looked at me, in the way he smiled, that made my heart race. And I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else entirely. The days after Kevin's arrival were filled with a strange tension that I couldn't explain. Everything seemed normal on the surface: family dinners, light-hearted conversations, and catching up on lost time. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent of something unspoken, something heavy and unsettling. Kevin's gaze lingered just a second too long, and his tone, though casual, carried a weight that sent shivers down my spine. I found myself watching him more closely than I should have. I'd catch glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye, his confident stride as he walked across the room, the way his smile seemed to reach me even when it wasn't meant for me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. And every time I noticed, my stomach tightened with a mix of anxiety and something else I didn't want to name. Late one evening, as I folded laundry in the living room, Kevin walked in. He leaned casually against the doorway, his arms crossed, watching me. "You always work so hard," he said, his voice soft yet charged with something unspoken. I glanced up, offering a polite smile. "Someone has to keep this place running," I replied, hoping my tone was light enough to end the conversation. But he didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on me in a way that made my heart pound. "You deserve more than this," he said finally, his words hanging in the air like a challenge. I froze for a moment before forcing myself to laugh. "Life isn't about what we deserve, Kevin. It's about what we make of it." He didn't reply, but his expression said enough. It was a mix of understanding and defiance, as if he wanted to say more but chose not to. Instead, he gave me a small, almost knowing smile and walked away. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, my hands trembling slightly as I returned to folding the laundry. As the days went on, small things began to add up. An accidental touch as he passed by, a fleeting smile that felt too intimate, or the way he'd find excuses to be in the same room as me. I started questioning myself, wondering if I was imagining things, if the tension I felt was all in my head. But every time our eyes met, I knew it wasn't. One afternoon, I found him in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge. "Looking for something?" I asked, my voice steady despite the way my pulse quickened. He straightened up, holding a bottle of water, and turned to face me. "Just trying to feel at home," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "But this place doesn't feel like it used to." I frowned, unsure of what he meant. "Things change, Kevin. It's been 3 years. You've grown, and so have we." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said, his tone suddenly serious. "I've grown, but some things never change." There it was again, that weight, that unspoken meaning behind his words. I felt it in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I turned away, busying myself with wiping down the counter, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Mary," he said softly, and I froze. "I missed you." The words were simple, innocent on the surface, but they sent a shockwave through me. I turned to face him, forcing a smile. "We all missed you, Kevin," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray the storm inside me. He nodded, his eyes locked on mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then, as if sensing the tension, he stepped back and left the room. But the damage was done. The cracks were forming, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. Something was happening, something I couldn't control, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop it. It started with the smallest of moments, ones that seemed inconsequential at first but quickly began to unravel everything I had tried so hard to hold together. Kevin's presence became a constant in my day, whether I wanted it or not. He was always there, a lingering shadow, a subtle reminder of the boundaries we were beginning to cross. One evening, Bob had left to run errands, leaving Kevin and me alone in the house. I busied myself in the kitchen, determined to keep things normal. My hands moved mechanically as I chopped vegetables, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the subtle interactions with Kevin over the past few days. I didn't hear him enter the kitchen until he was standing just a few feet behind me. "Need any help?" His voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the knife I was holding. Turning to face him, I tried to compose myself. "No, I've got it under control," I said, hoping my voice sounded steady. He stepped closer anyway, leaning against the counter, his gaze fixed on me. "You're always so independent," he said, his tone soft but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I tried to ignore the way my pulse quickened and focused on my task. "I like to keep busy," I replied, not daring to meet his eyes. But Kevin wasn't the kind of man to be ignored. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming as he stood beside me. "You know," he said, his voice lower now, "you don't have to keep pretending around me." "I know you, Mary." Those words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I stopped chopping and set the knife down, taking a deep breath before turning to face him. "Kevin, you're reading too much into things," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay composed. Whatever you think is happening, it can't happen. It's wrong." He didn't move, didn't break eye contact. Instead, he leaned in closer, his hand resting on the counter beside mine. "Is it wrong, or are you just afraid to admit what you feel?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His presence was suffocating, his gaze piercing through every defense I had. "Kevin, please," I finally managed, my voice barely audible. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He smiled then, but it wasn't a sweet or innocent smile. It was knowing, confident, as if he could see through every lie I tried to tell myself. "Harder," he repeated, his tone teasing. "I think it's you who's making it hard, Mary. You're fighting something that's already there." I wanted to deny it, to push him away, but the truth was that I couldn't. The tension between us had grown too strong, too undeniable. And in that moment, I hated myself for the way my body betrayed me, for the way my heart raced every time he was near. Before I could say anything more, Kevin reached out and brushed a stray strand of hair from my face. His touch was gentle, yet it sent a jolt of electricity through me. "You feel it too, don't you?" he asked softly, his eyes searching mine for an answer I wasn't ready to give. "I can't," I whispered, shaking my head, but my words lacked conviction. Kevin stepped even closer, his hand lingering near my face. "You can't or you won't," he challenged, his voice steady and sure. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. Every rational thought in my head screamed at me to step back, to end this before it went any further. But instead, I stood frozen, caught in the pull of his gaze. "Kevin, this isn't right," I said, my voice trembling. He leaned in, his lips just inches from mine. "Right or wrong doesn't matter, Mary," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What matters is how we feel. And I know you feel it too." I closed my eyes, willing myself to step away, to regain control. But when his hand moved to rest gently on my waist, I felt myself falter. The warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, it was all too much. I opened my eyes and met his, and in that moment, I knew I was losing the battle. "Kevin, we can't," I said again, but this time my voice was weaker, almost pleading. He smiled softly, his hand moving to cup my face. "I know you're scared," he said, "but you don't have to be. Just let yourself feel it." And then, before I could stop it, his lips brushed against mine. It was a fleeting moment, soft and hesitant, but it was enough to shatter the walls I had built. I pulled away, my breath uneven, but the damage was done. The line we weren't supposed to cross was behind us now, and there was no turning back. The next few days were a blur, a chaotic mix of stolen moments and suppressed emotions. Kevin's presence loomed over every corner of the house, and no matter how hard I tried to keep my distance, it was impossible. He had become a constant, his words and touches lingering long after he had left the room. The boundaries between us were dissolving, and the guilt was suffocating. One evening, as Bob sat in the living room watching television, Kevin found me alone in the kitchen. I was washing dishes, trying to keep my mind occupied, when I felt his presence behind me. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. His closeness was unmistakable, a heat that seemed to radiate from him and pull me in. "Mary," he said softly, his voice low and intimate. I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the sink for support. "Not now, Kevin," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Please, not now." But Kevin didn't move. Instead, he stepped closer, his hand lightly brushing against mine as I reached for a dish. The simple touch sent a jolt through me, and I pulled my hand back as if burned. "You can't keep avoiding me," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "We both know what this is." I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "Kevin, stop," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "This has to end. It's wrong, and you know it." He didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped even closer, his gaze locking onto mine. "Wrong," he said, his voice steady. "Then why does it feel so right? Why can't you look me in the eye and tell me you don't feel the same?" I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He was right. I couldn't deny the pull between us, no matter how hard I tried. "It doesn't matter what I feel," I said finally, my voice trembling. "What matters is that it's not right." Kevin reached out, his hand gently cupping my face. "What if it is right?" he asked softly. "What if this, us, was meant to happen?" Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. We both froze, the spell between us breaking as reality came crashing back. Bob appeared in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room. "Everything okay in here?" he asked, his tone casual but his gaze lingering on Kevin. "Yes," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just cleaning up." Bob nodded, his attention shifting to Kevin. "I thought you'd gone to bed," he said, his voice carrying a note of curiosity. Kevin shrugged, his demeanor calm and collected. "Just grabbing a drink," he replied, holding up a glass of water as if to prove his point. Bob didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "Well, don't stay up too late," he said, his tone light but firm. "We've got an early morning tomorrow." As Bob left the room, the tension between Kevin and me was palpable. I avoided his gaze, focusing on the dishes in front of me. "This has to stop," I said quietly, my voice trembling. "It's too dangerous." But Kevin didn't respond. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Dangerous or not, it's real," he said softly, his voice steady. "And you can't run from it forever." The following night, things came to a head. Bob had gone out with friends, leaving Kevin and me alone once again. I tried to keep my distance, staying in my room to avoid temptation. But as the evening wore on, I found myself wandering to the kitchen, unable to escape the pull of his presence. When I entered the room, Kevin was waiting for me. He stood by the counter, his posture relaxed but his expression intense. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. "There's nothing to talk about," I said, my voice trembling. "We both know this is wrong." Kevin shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "What we feel isn't wrong," he said firmly. "Deny it all you want, but you can't change what's already there." Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his hand reaching out to gently touch my arm. The warmth of his touch was intoxicating, and I felt my resolve crumbling. "Kevin, please," I whispered, my voice shaking. "This can't happen." But Kevin didn't let go. Instead, he leaned in, his face inches from mine. "It already has," he said softly, his words sending a shiver down my spine. The sound of the front door opening shattered the moment, and we both froze. Bob's voice echoed through the house, cheerful and oblivious. "Mary? Kevin? I'm back," he called, his tone light. Panic set in as Kevin stepped back, his expression unreadable. I turned away, my hands trembling as I tried to compose myself. "Go," I whispered, my voice urgent. "He can't see you here." Kevin hesitated, his gaze lingering on me for a moment before he nodded and slipped out of the room. I stood there, my heart racing as I listened to Bob's footsteps approaching. When he entered the kitchen, I forced a smile, hoping he couldn't see the turmoil written all over my face. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone concerned. "You look pale." "Just tired," I replied quickly, avoiding his gaze. "It's been a long day." Bob didn't seem convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he wrapped an arm around me, pulling me into a brief hug. "Get some rest," he said softly. "You've been working too hard." I nodded, my mind racing as I tried to process what had just happened. The cracks in my carefully constructed life were growing wider, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The storm I had feared for weeks finally broke, and its aftermath was devastating. Bob's suspicions had grown steadily, fed by the subtle but undeniable changes in my demeanor. I thought I had been careful, thought I had hidden the tension between Kevin and me well enough, but Bob wasn't a fool. He noticed the lingering glances, the uneasy silences, the way I seemed to avoid Kevin one moment and gravitate toward him the next. It was late one night when the truth began to surface. Bob and I were sitting in the living room, the silence between us heavy. He cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. "Mary, is there something you need to tell me?" My heart dropped, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. Bob's eyes narrowed slightly, his gaze steady. "You've been distant lately," he said. "And Kevin? I don't know. Something feels off. I just need to know, are you hiding something from me?" The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I struggled to find a response. "Of course not," I lied, forcing a smile that I hoped looked convincing. "I've just been stressed, that's all." But Bob didn't look convinced. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "If there's anything you need to say, Mary, now's the time," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'd rather hear it from you than find out another way." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I wanted to tell him the truth, to unburden myself of the guilt that had been suffocating me for weeks. But the fear of losing everything, my marriage, my stability, my life as I knew it, kept the words locked inside me. "There's nothing, Bob," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The tension between us lingered, but Bob didn't press the issue further that night. I could feel the doubt in his gaze, the unspoken questions he was too afraid to ask. It was only a matter of time before he found the answers on his own. And he did. It happened 2 days later, on a quiet afternoon when I thought I was alone in the house. Kevin and I were in the kitchen, our conversation low and urgent. "You need to leave," I told him, my voice shaking. "This can't go on anymore. Bob is starting to suspect something." Kevin's jaw tightened, his expression a mix of frustration and hurt. "So that's it," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "You're just going to throw me out and pretend like none of this ever happened?" "It has to be this way," I said, my eyes pleading with him to understand. "If Bob finds out, I can't lose him, Kevin. I can't lose everything." Before Kevin could respond, the sound of a door creaking open froze us both in place. We turned to see Bob standing in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and betrayal. "Lose me," he said, his voice barely audible. "What exactly have you been doing that would make you lose me?" The room fell silent, the weight of his words crashing down on us. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, to deny, but the look on Bob's face told me it was too late. He had heard enough. "Bob, I began, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Don't," he said, his voice shaking. "I want the truth, Mary. All of it." The truth spilled out in broken fragments, each word cutting deeper than the last. I told him about the feelings I couldn't control, the moments of weakness that had spiraled into something far worse. I tried to explain, to justify, to apologize, but nothing I said could undo the damage. Bob's expression hardened as he turned to Kevin, his voice cold and filled with anger. "You were family," he said, his words laced with bitterness. "How could you do this to me?" Kevin didn't respond. He looked at Bob, his jaw clenched and his eyes filled with regret, but he said nothing. The silence was deafening, the air between us thick with tension and heartbreak. Bob left the room without another word, slamming the door behind him. I stood frozen, my body trembling as the weight of what had just happened settled over me. Kevin reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away, the tears streaming down my face. "Don't," I said, my voice breaking. "Just go." Kevin hesitated for a moment before nodding and walking out of the house. The sound of the door closing behind him felt like the final nail in the coffin of everything I had destroyed. That night, Bob didn't come home. I sat alone in the living room, the silence around me almost unbearable. I replayed the events of the day over and over in my mind, the guilt and regret consuming me. I had made a mistake, a series of mistakes, and now I was paying the price. The fallout was devastating. Bob and I barely spoke in the days that followed. The distance between us grew, a chasm that felt impossible to bridge. Kevin was gone, but the damage he had left behind remained, a constant reminder of the choices I had made. I had betrayed the man who loved me, and I wasn't sure if there was any way to come back from it. The days following Bob's discovery were some of the hardest of my life. The silence between us was unbearable, each passing moment filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. Kevin had left town, disappearing as suddenly as he had come back, but his absence didn't ease the pain. Instead, it amplified it, leaving me alone to confront the mess I had made. I wanted to reach out to Bob, to apologize again, to beg for forgiveness, but every time I tried, the words wouldn't come. He avoided me, spending long hours at work or out of the house altogether. The few times we were in the same room, the air was thick with tension and unspoken hurt. I could see the betrayal etched on his face, and it broke me to know I had caused it. One evening, after days of silence, Bob finally spoke. We were sitting in the living room, the space between us feeling like a vast, unbridgeable chasm. "Why, Mary?" he asked, his voice heavy with emotion. "Why did you do it?" I looked at him, my heart breaking at the pain in his eyes. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice trembling. "I wasn't thinking. I let myself feel things I shouldn't have. And I'm so sorry, Bob. I never wanted to hurt you." Bob shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and sadness. "But you did," he said. "You hurt me, Mary. You broke us." The words hit me like a blow, and I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "And I'll regret it for the rest of my life." For a long time, we sat in silence, the weight of everything hanging heavy between us. Finally, Bob let out a deep sigh. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said, his voice raw. "I want to, but I don't know if I can." The honesty in his words was like a knife to my heart, but I knew he had every right to feel that way. "I understand," I said softly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope, one day, you'll find it in your heart to give it." In the weeks that followed, we began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. It wasn't easy. There were days when the hurt felt too fresh, the betrayal too deep. But we started small, with honest conversations and moments of vulnerability. I told Bob everything, leaving no detail unspoken. It was excruciating, but it was the only way to begin healing. Through it all, I learned a hard but valuable lesson about the consequences of my actions. I had taken for granted the life I had built, the love and trust Bob had given me so freely. I had let myself be swept away by something fleeting, something that had no future, and in doing so, I had nearly destroyed everything that mattered to me. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that love is fragile. It's not something to be taken lightly or treated carelessly. It requires trust, respect, and commitment, things I had failed to honor in my moment of weakness. And while I can't undo the past, I can choose to be better moving forward. As for Kevin, I haven't heard from him since he left. Part of me wonders if he ever truly cared, or if I was just another conquest to him. But in the end, it doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm here, trying to put the pieces of my life back together and hoping that, someday, I'll earn back the trust one shattered. Life will never be the same as it was before, but perhaps that's for the best. This experience has changed me, forced me to confront parts of myself I'd rather not face. And while it's been painful, it's also been a wake-up call, a reminder of what truly matters. I don't know what the future holds for Bob and me, but I'm determined to fight for our marriage, to prove to him that I'm worth the second chance he's so hesitantly giving me. And maybe, just maybe, we'll come out of this stronger than before. This story may have ended here, but the journey is far from over. If you've ever faced moments of temptation or betrayal, what choices did you make? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. You won't want to miss what's coming next. It's going to be even more shocking and unforgettable.